Hi everyone, welcome to the Brooklyn Community Democracy Channel, BCDC. I'm Stephen Mance, your host, and we're glad to have you for this video of Brooklyn Community Beat. Today we're with David Roosevelt. David, good to see you.
Hi, good to see you, Steve. Thank you for having me here.
Oh, we're so happy to have you. So David has been very active with local gardening and very active in beautification efforts around the community. And today he's here to tell us about a very special project he has with native plants. So we're going to hear a little bit about that from David and all the exciting work he's doing. So David, please tell us, what's the goal of your project?
So I would like to encourage people to plant native plants. We'll explain what that is in a moment. In what I would say are called unused or underutilized parts of private spaces. So for example, if somebody has a garden, if they have a private house in the front garden or a back garden, or if you live in an apartment building and some areas are just not being used, they're growing weeds, or a business, anywhere you can find that is either underutilized and that it's just growing weeds or not being used, or not utilized at all, that's a green space, I would encourage people not only to plant there, but to plant native plants there. We can explain why, but that's the goal of the project.
Very neat. Well, could you explain to us what are native plants?
Sure. Well, native plants are plants, we can also use the words indigenous, and you can use that with animals as well. Plants that have evolved in that particular area. So they've evolved together with the animal population and the plant population together in that area. In other words, they were not introduced separately.
Right. They've been growing here over the millennia. Nobody external brought them here. No human brought them here.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And
Okay.
so we'll talk about why that's an advantage, but that would be a definition, yes.
That's the definition. Excellent. Yeah. So how might native plants be good for our environment overall? Like what's the benefit of them to the environment?
So what I'd like to mention, the reason I'm looking to do this is that I'd like to identify what I'm calling existential threats to humanity. Mm-hmm. So for example, the big ones, pollution, climate change. And one of those large existential threats is habitat destruction. And so the question here, what we're looking at here is trying to remediate that, trying to undo habitat destruction by putting back habitat. We all hear today about so many issues with pollinators, like butterflies and bees dying out. Part of that, the issue of that is that there's just no place for them to pollinate anymore. There are no more flowers, there are no more native plants. So the idea here is to restore all of that. And I'll just mention, when we talk about restoration, I'm thinking about this in terms of three levels, let's say. Large-scale restoration or large-scale preservation would be places like national parks, like Yellowstone, or the Tongass in Alaska, huge, gigantic areas. So that's necessary because some plants and animals require large areas. They won't behave normally if it's just a Central Park size space. You need large areas. Number two, connect those areas because there are animals that for millennia have been traveling, whether it's a migration like caribou or birds in the sky or even in the water, by the way, talking about water as well, the humpback whales, or just a raccoon crossing to get food to the other side of the road. But animals need to be able to connect to preserved areas without getting themselves killed. So the second one would be large preserved areas. The second would be corridors, connecting those areas. The third, though, are restoring small spaces or any spaces that people could do privately. And this is where what we're doing here comes in. Because it doesn't matter if you only have a terrace and you could put potted native plants out, or a front yard, or a backyard, or any kind of space. That's something that the other two we're talking about are really the realm of government. Okay, government would have millions of dollars to preserve a Yellowstone, or millions of dollars to make these corridors. But anybody can plant native plants. And that would be restorative for the environment. So that would be, I guess, the first answer to that question.
So I guess you're saying when the native plants are reintroduced into the environment that they were first grown in, where they first evolved, it helps the environment because they belong there anyway. They have an established niche.
Right, exactly. So that would bring us to that exactly. So there is actually a checks and balances when you have native plants, because these native plants and animals have grown together over these millennia. When you introduce an introduced species, a species that had not been there before, one of two things can happen. Either that animal or that plant will die out very quickly and usually horribly, or will become very successful because there are no enemies for that. In fact, we just had a couple of days ago, we had a situation where the Parks Department pulled a 4-foot alligator out of Prospect Park.
Wow.
That's a good example. So this is an example of a non-native species which is in there, which could be dangerous and would potentially die a very bad death for that animal. However, in an environment that's favorable, native species can, invasive species can completely take over. And when we go outside, most of the plants you look at, most of the trees you look at, most of the birds, you don't realize we're not here 300 years ago. Mm-hmm. These are species that have come in and they've overtaken, they've overtaken the native species. What we want to do in this project, or in this, what we're trying to do in any kind of a native plants garden, is to allow for the competition of the native plants, which should then attract native animals. So then you're attracting the native butterflies and the bees and other animals, and giving them even a small environment to for that purpose. So
well, that sounds very helpful. Are there other advantages of native plants, or is that sort of the overall? Is there more additional advantages you want to mention?
Yes. So there are some particular advantages of a native plants garden over, let's say, a standard garden. Two areas that I'd like to talk about. One is in the positive. They provide, as we were just mentioning, they provide habitat. They provide food and habitat, food and shelter for native animals. But the other is the maintenance of the garden itself. If you have a standard garden that's non-native, then what do we have to do? Whether a lawn, in fact, we'll talk about a lawn separately. There's so much to talk about. But in any kind of a non-native garden, what do you have to do? You have to mow. You have to apply fertilizer, artificial fertilizer usually, herbicide, and insecticide. Okay, all of these things are really bad for the environment. Again, we'll talk more about that in another video, but all of these things get into the watershed and could even get into your own food supply, or if you're walking along. So, if you're walking along, you could pick up insecticide and so on. So, in a native plants garden, because these are plants that have grown in this environment over millennia, they don't need extra watering. And I forgot to mention that also. Water, which is so precious, you don't have to water these plants unless there's a drought situation, because they're used to this kind of environment. And there's no need for herbicides.
You're saying tropical plants or fragile, they require much more water because they're used to it from their habitat.
Exactly.
Okay.
Or even tomatoes, or even herbs, or anything, or non-edible, or roses, anything that's exactly as you said. They would require more water, and here we're talking from New York City, but other areas like Arizona, California, they don't have that water to spare, and that water is being used in these gardens. It's unfortunate. So a native plants garden, you would not require that kind of extra water space.
Terrific. Okay, so let's say I want to plant a native garden. What are some of the factors I would need to think about in planning to do that?
All right. So when you want to plant a native plants garden, a few things you need to do. I will say this, once you have it established, it requires, I would say, less or different kind of care than a regular lawn or flower garden would, but it does require some care and some preparation. So we can mention that. So first thing you need to do is you want to figure out a few basic factors. What kind of sunlight exposure do you have? What kind of soil do you have? Is it more of a humus soil? Is it more of an organic soil or not? And what kind of a climate are you in? What region are you in? Are you in more of the, let's say in the United States particularly, are you in the Midwest, the West, the Northeast, the Southeast? These are regions. You can very often buy your plants very often by region. So, but sunlight exposure is important, as we mentioned. And what are your weather conditions? What kind of water do you expect to get? What kind of rain and so on do you expect to get?
So some of this is environment just for the region, and other things might depend on your actual location. Are you near a waterway? Are you inland? Are you on a elevated area? Are you in a lower area?
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and also what region you're in. Where are you? Are you in like I said, the Northeast, Southeast, Midwest? These are all because you can buy plants according to region. You can buy seeds according to region. So once you do that, then you have that idea. Then you want to think about what do you want from your garden. So are you trying to get from a native plants garden? Now we're not talking about a vegetable garden, but do you want color? Or you just want color? Do you want to attract butterflies? Do you want to attract hummingbirds? Or what are you trying to get from your garden? So once you have an idea about that, all right, what is your soil type? what zone are you in? There's a soil zone. What region are you in, and what do you want from your garden? Then you can go ahead and talk about buying the plants.
Terrific. Okay, well, tell us more about that. If I want to buy native plant seeds, what would be some good places to look for those?
So fortunately, today we do have places that we probably didn't have 30 years ago, because this is becoming popular. In fact, this is what we're doing here is really what had been known maybe 30 years ago. Is you might be more familiar with the term a butterfly garden. And butterfly garden was used. But today it's more commonly called a native plants garden. It's more of a general term. So you can buy these type of plants from companies. For example, the company that I work with is the American Meadows out of Vermont, and they're online. But there are many companies that do that. I'm sure if you just search the internet for native plant suppliers, you can find. But in this case, I use American Meadows. They have an excellent website. They have high quality seeds. And they have very good support on the website and on the phone, including and instructive videos. So
Neat.
but there are other sites and there are other organizations like the National Wildlife Federation encourages this. So when you search that on the web, native plants or indigenous plants and so on, there are a number of places that you can get good quality plants with instructions on how to plant them today.
Terrific. So you're telling people do a Google search because there are sellers that specifically address this type of product, and you can find it on the internet.